A police officer finds a dog tied up and left to die, hanging from a tree, and in that precise instant, his heart stops at the cruel sight his eyes can barely process. What he discovers next will forever change not only his life, but the way we understand both cruelty and human compassion. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when Jose Garcia began his morning routine. Desert dust floated like a golden haze as his patrol car rolled slowly along the outskirts of Dry Pine. He had been in that forgotten town for 3 years, where the days passed with the same monotony as the wind dragging sand across the ground. That's when he saw it, an irregular silhouette swaying gently against the reddish dawn sky. At first, he thought it might be a trash bag caught in the branches of the old mesquite, the only tree that had survived the drought in that area. But something about that swinging shape sent a chill crawling up his spine. Jose stopped the vehicle and stepped out cautiously. As he drew closer, the horror began to take shape. It wasn't trash, it was a body. The body of a dog, hanging by its hind legs, tied with a rough, worn rope. The animal was motionless, but as the officer came nearer, he noticed a faint movement in its chest. "My God, it's alive," he murmured, hurriedly pulling out his pocket knife. With trembling hands, he cut the rope, supporting the animal's weight so it wouldn't fall hard to the ground. The dog, emaciated and covered in wounds, weighed barely half of what it should. Its coat, once glossy, was now dull and stained with dried blood. As he gently laid it on the dusty ground, Jose Garcia noticed something that froze his blood. Those scars on the muzzle, that pattern of markings on the chest, and above all, those eyes. Eyes that, despite the suffering, still held a light he knew better than anyone. "Leon," he whispered in disbelief, a knot forming in his throat. The animal responded with a barely audible whimper and a weak wag of the tail. There was no doubt. It was Leon, his former canine partner, the same dog everyone at the station had presumed dead after that failed operation 2 years ago. The night Jose had never forgiven himself for, the one that haunted every nightmare. Carefully, he wrapped the dog in his jacket and carried him to the patrol car. As he drove back toward town, tears blurred his vision. How had Leon survived? Where had he been all this time? And most importantly, who had done this to him? A mix of guilt, anger, and strange relief churned inside him as he pressed the accelerator. If Leon had come back from the dead, maybe the ghosts of their shared past had too. And this time, Jose was determined not to fail him. The news of Leon's discovery spread through the small Dry Pine station like wildfire in dry grass. Officers crowded at the entrance of the break room, where the dog, lying on an improvised blanket, struggled to breathe. His once thick, shiny coat now showed bald patches and scars that told of months of systematic abuse. His ribs jutted sharply beneath his skin, silent witnesses to prolonged hunger. Jose Garcia stood in the corner, eyes fixed on his old partner. The officer, always known for his unshakable composure, now clenched his jaw to contain a storm of emotions. Every labored breath from Leon was like a dagger to his conscience. "I should have looked for you harder," he whispered to himself, remembering that fateful night of the operation when everyone assumed the dog had died in the shootout. Clara Lopez was the first to break through the circle of onlookers and step forward with purpose. The young officer, transferred to Dry Pine just 6 months earlier, didn't know Leon's story personally, but her protective instinct kicked in immediately. "He needs urgent veterinary care," she said, pulling out her phone. "I know Dr. Ramirez. He'll come, even on a Sunday." Jose watched as Clara knelt beside the animal, gently stroking the least injured areas. She spoke to the dog in whispers, promising that everything would be all right, that no one would ever hurt him again. Her eyes, full of determination, contrasted with Jose's distant stare. "He was the best dog in the department," the officer finally murmured, stepping closer with heavy footsteps. "Never lost a trail, never quit." Clara looked up, understanding the weight of those words. "But you quit on him, didn't you?" There was no accusation in her voice, only the truth Jose had been torturing himself with for 2 years. The veterinarian arrived quickly, examining the animal with precise movements. Meanwhile, Clara prepared a corner of the station with clean blankets and a bowl of fresh water. Her dedication was absolute, as if Leon had always been hers. That night, while the dog slept sedated after receiving initial care, Jose stood watching from the doorway. Memories he had buried under layers of overwork and sleepless nights now returned with crushing force. The training sessions, the chases, the mutual trust forged in life-or-death moments. Clara appeared beside him, offering a coffee. "You can't change the past," she said softly, "but he's here now and he needs both of us." Jose nodded silently. The guilt wouldn't vanish, but maybe, just maybe, the time for redemption had come. At the small Dry Pine veterinary clinic, Leon began to show signs of physical recovery. His external wounds were healing slowly, but Jose noticed something unsettling in the dog's behavior. On his third day back at the station, while organizing evidence from a minor case, the officers saw his old partner suddenly tense up. Leon limped toward a sealed evidence bag containing confiscated narcotics. The week before, the dog had started sniffing the plastic frantically, growling low and nervously, as if recognizing something familiar in that forbidden scent. "What's wrong, buddy?" murmured Jose, a chill running down his spine. The animal ignored the basic commands he once obeyed perfectly. Instead, he scratched insistently at the bag, his breathing quickening. A dull ache settled in the officer's chest. The question burned inside him. What the hell had they done to his partner during those 2 missing years? Clara, who had been watching from her desk, approached cautiously. Always attentive to detail, she knelt beside the dog and began stroking him to calm him. "Jose, look at this," she said, gently parting the fur on the animal's abdomen. There was a fresh scar there, unrelated to the abuse injuries, a thin pink line about 10 centimeters long running along Leon's side. It was almost hidden by the fur, but clearly the result of recent surgery. Alarmed, the 2 officers wasted no time. That same afternoon, they took the dog to Dr. Ramirez, the town's only veterinarian. After a thorough examination, the specialist recommended a full X-ray. The results confirmed their worst fears. The images showed clear signs of a crude abdominal surgery, and, more disturbingly, small remnants of what appeared to be ruptured capsules in the intestinal tract. "Someone used this animal as a mule," the vet explained, pointing to the dark spots on the scan. "These are traces of containers that probably carried drugs. Some burst inside him." Jose clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. "This explains his reaction to the evidence bag," she whispered, "and why they abandoned him. He wasn't useful to them anymore." The officer looked at Leon, sedated on the examination table. The truth was too cruel. His loyal partner had been turned into a tool of the drug trade, a disposable container, and now the questions multiplied like shadows in the desert. That night, Dry Pine lay under the heavy silence of the desert. The wind carried small whirlwinds of sand that rattled against the windows of Jose Garcia's modest home. The officer couldn't sleep, too disturbed by recent events. Every few minutes he got up to check on Leon, who dozed fitfully on an improvised bed by the stove. The dog twitched in his sleep, as if chasing invisible ghosts only he could see. Jose looked at the scars on his old partner's body and felt a mix of rage and guilt tearing through his chest. He stroked the animal's back gently, trying to give him a calm he didn't feel himself. Then the shrill ring of his phone shattered the stillness. Garcia answered in a hoarse voice. The call was brief but urgent. A neighbor had reported suspicious movement at the old abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Someone had seen a minor lurking there at that late hour. Without a second thought, Jose called Clara Lopez. The young officer answered on the first ring, as if she too had been awake, wrestling with her own demons. "I'm on my way," was her only reply. 20 minutes later, both officers stood before the creaking structure of the warehouse. The building loomed like a menacing shadow against the star-studded sky over Dry Pine. Clara adjusted her flashlight while Jose checked his service weapon. "Watch my back," he whispered, pushing the rusted door, which gave way with a chilling screech. The beams of their flashlights carved ghostly shapes among the stacked boxes, and the cobwebs draped in every corner. Dust floated in the air, visible in the light and making it harder to breathe. A faint, almost imperceptible sound drew them toward the back of the building. There, huddled among old sacks and debris, they found Luis Martin. The teenager stared at them with wide, fearful eyes, like a cornered animal. His clothes were covered in dust and dirt, and a thin line of dried blood marked his right cheek. "It's okay, we're not going to hurt you," Clara said, lowering her flashlight so as not to blind him. Jose approached cautiously, recognizing the terror in the boy's gaze, the same he had seen in Leon's eyes when he found him hanging from that tree. "I'm Officer Garcia. You're safe now," he assured him, extending his hand slowly. Luis didn't answer, but he didn't run either. He just watched them with a mix of distrust and desperation, as if weighing whether these strangers were a greater or lesser threat than whatever had driven him to hide in this godforsaken place. Later, Luis sat in the corner of the interrogation room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the dusty floor. His worn sneakers tapped nervously against the tiles while Jose Garcia and Clara Lopez exchanged worried glances. The teenager had refused water, food, and even the blanket they offered to ward off the chill of the dry pine dawn. "No one's gonna hurt you here," Clara insisted gently, moving closer without invading his space. "We just want to understand what you were doing in that warehouse." The boy pressed his lips together and shook his head. His eyes, red from holding back tears, showed a fear that went far beyond being caught by the police. From the doorway, Jose had a sudden hunch. He stepped out briefly and returned with Leon, who moved with difficulty, still recovering from his injuries. The dog's ears perked up when he saw the boy, and he limped forward slowly. "Easy, Leon," Jose murmured, surprised by the animal's reaction. To everyone's astonishment, the dog ignored the command and went straight to Luis, resting his head gently on the boy's knees. Something in that gesture, the warmth of that contact, broke through the teenager's defenses. His shoulders began to shake as heavy tears rolled down his cheeks. I saw when they hanged him," Luis sobbed, stroking Leon's coarse fur. "I didn't want them to hurt him, like they did to my dad, like they did to the other dogs." A chill ran down Jose's spine. He crouched in front of the boy, keeping a respectful distance. "Do you know who did this?" he asked, voice controlled though anger threatened to spill over inside him. Luis nodded faintly, wiping his tears with the sleeve of his worn sweatshirt. "My father worked for them. At first, he only transported packages," he confessed in a halting voice. When he tried to get out, he couldn't finish the sentence. Clara sat beside him and, with a maternal gesture that surprised even herself, took his hand. "Now they're after you, aren't they?" she asked softly. The boy nodded again. "They say I know too much, that I inherited my father's debts," Luis explained, while Leon stayed pressed against him as if he understood his pain. "They use dogs to transport things, train them, operate on them, and then—" Jose exchanged a look with Clara. A crucial piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. The officer felt the investigation take an unexpected turn, linking Leon's suffering to a network far wider and darker than they had imagined. "We won't let them find you," Jose promised firmly, "or anyone else." The Dry Pine Station had become a second home for Leon. As the case progressed, Clara Lopez spent hours with the animal, watching him slowly regain some vitality. That afternoon, sitting on the office floor, the young officer absent-mindedly stroked the dog's rough coat when her fingers caught on something unusual. "Jose, come see this," she called, eyes fixed on the old collar that had survived the animal's ordeal. Officer Garcia approached with a tired step, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights spent reviewing every detail of the case. "There's something hard here in the stitching," she explained, pointing to a small, barely noticeable lump. "It's not part of the original design." With delicate hands, Clara used small scissors from the first aid kit to carefully unpick the worn fabric. Leon watched intently, as if he understood the importance of the moment. When the seam gave way, a tiny metallic device fell onto the station floor. "It's a flash drive," Jose murmured, picking it up in disbelief. They hid it inside his own collar. Pedro Hernandez, who had just walked in with coffee for everyone, set the cups down and hurried over. The federal agent examined the device with a practiced eye. "This could hold critical information," Pedro said as he plugged the drive into the station's computer. "We're going to need extra protection for you and the dog." The screen lit up, revealing dozens of encrypted files. Clara held her breath while Jose clenched his fists. It was all there. Precise GPS coordinates, transport routes, code names, quantities. "My God," Clara whispered. "They used him as a living mule." Jose ran a hand over his face, trying to control the anger rising inside him. Leon had been turned into a tool for trafficking, a living container carrying vital information for the criminal network. The scars on his abdomen now took on a terrifying meaning. "This explains why they were so desperate to get him back," Pedro said as he transferred the files to a secure device, "and why they tried to eliminate him when he was no longer useful." Leon walked over to Jose and rested his head on his former partner's knee. The officer gently stroked the dog's ears, silently promising that those responsible would pay for every scar, for every day of suffering. "We're going to need reinforcements," Pedro decided, closing the laptop. "This is much bigger than we thought." Clara looked at Leon with a mix of admiration and sadness. "You've been braver than any of us," she whispered to the dog as the investigation took a completely new direction. The arrival of the FBI in Dry Pine disrupted the small town's routine. Pedro Hernandez stepped out of the black SUV with a firm stride, adjusting his tie as desert dust swirled around him. His face bore the weariness of someone who had seen too much, but his eyes still held unshakable resolve. Jose Garcia watched from the station doorway, feeling both relief and unease. "Officer Garcia, I presume," Pedro said, extending his hand. "I've read your report on the case. Impressive work." The federal agent wasted no time on formalities. Inside the small meeting room, he spread out maps and photographs that revealed the scale of the criminal operation. This wasn't just an isolated incident involving Leon. It was a sophisticated network using animals as living mules to transport drugs and information across the border. "These people will stop at nothing," Pedro explained, pointing to routes marked in red. "They've invested too much in this system, and Leon represents a crucial link they've lost." Clara Lopez, seated beside Jose, took notes furiously. She had formed a special bond with the dog during his recovery, and each new revelation about the cruelty he'd endured hit her hard. "Do you think they'll come for him?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I have no doubt," the federal agent replied. "That animal could be carrying information worth millions, or at least they believe he is. They won't rest until they get him back." Hernandez's warning landed like lead on Jose's shoulders. Looking out the window at Leon resting in the shade of a tree in the back lot, he felt the protective circle around them tightening. Instinctively, he touched the scar on his forearm, a reminder of the failed operation when he thought he'd lost his partner forever. "We can move him to a safe location," Pedro suggested. "We have special facilities for protected witnesses." Jose shook his head. The thought of being separated from Leon again was unbearable. In the silence that followed, while the other officers discussed strategies and watch rotations, something shifted inside him. A steely resolve born of pain and guilt settled in his chest. "I won't fail him again," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. That night, while the town slept under the star-streaked desert sky, Jose stayed awake beside his canine partner. The solitude had never felt so heavy, yet paradoxically, he had never felt so determined. This time, he would protect Leon at any cost. The moon barely lit the empty streets of Dry Pine when the first window shattered in Jose Garcia's modest home. Leon, still weak from his injuries, suddenly rose, letting out a howl that froze the blood of everyone present. Jose leapt from the bed, grabbing his service weapon in an automatic movement born of years on the job. "Down, Luis!" he shouted, shoving the teenager behind the couch. Shadows moved with military precision around the house. Jose counted at least 4 silhouettes outlined against the desert darkness. He knew they were at a disadvantage. The attackers were here for Leon, and possibly for the boy who could identify them. A second window shattered, and something metallic rolled across the wooden floor. Jose recognized it instantly. "Smoke grenade," he warned, covering his face as a gray cloud flooded the room. Luis trembled, clutching Leon's fur. The dog, despite his pain, stayed alert, growling toward the back door where the hinges were starting to give under systematic blows. Time was running out. Jose weighed his options as the smoke made it harder and harder to see. Then the crack of a gunshot split the night, not from inside, but from the yard. A second blast was followed by shouts and hurried footsteps. "Get out of here, vermin!" The rough, booming voice of Tomas Garcia rang through the darkness. "The next one goes straight to the head." The old man appeared in the back doorway, his figure silhouetted against the night, holding a shotgun with the steadiness only decades of experience could give. The Guardian, as the townsfolk called him, advanced with purpose, his eyes reflecting an old pain transformed into protective fury. "These cowards attack in packs," Tomas muttered as Jose secured the windows, "just like the ones who took my Raul." Jose knew the story. Tomas's son had vanished years ago under circumstances never explained. Now he understood the ferocity with which the old man defended his home, as if in Luis he saw the son he couldn't save. The attackers pulled back in the face of unexpected resistance. Their shadows melted into the night, leaving behind muttered threats that the desert wind carried away. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the three men stood in silence, each processing what had just happened. Leon limped over to Tomas and rested his head against the old man's calloused hand, a gesture that seemed to seal a silent alliance. "We're family now," Tomas said simply, placing one hand on Jose's shoulder and the other on Luis's head. "And in this land, family is protected to the end." That night, under the star-filled sky of dry pine, an unbreakable bond was forged between them, tempered by danger and the shared determination to survive. With every passing minute, the tension inside Jose Garcia grew. The plan he had worked out with Pedro Hernandez was risky, maybe too risky. Using Leon as bait to draw out the cartel leaders turned his stomach. After everything his canine partner had endured, putting him in danger again felt like an unforgivable betrayal. "It's our best option," Pedro insisted, adjusting his bulletproof vest. "We know they want him back at any cost." Jose nodded silently, running a hand along Leon's back. The dog looked at him with those eyes that seemed to understand everything, as if ready to sacrifice himself once more. "I promise I won't fail you this time," the officer whispered, remembering that night of the failed operation 2 years ago. The old warehouse on the outskirts of Dry Pine had been meticulously prepared. Undercover agents took up strategic positions in the shadows, while others watched from seemingly abandoned vehicles. From a surveillance van, Clara Lopez monitored every movement through cameras installed hours earlier. All in position, the young officer confirmed over the comms. Perimeter secure. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of red, when Jose led Leon to the center of the warehouse and tied him with a long lead to a column. Trained for high-risk situations, the dog stayed calm but alert. "I'll come back for you," Jose promised before retreating to his post. Minutes turned into hours. The silence was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Tomas Garcia, who had insisted on taking part despite his age, watched from an elevated perch, shotgun ready. The old man had lost too much to sit idly by. Pedro crept up to Jose, moss position. "Think they'll come," he whispered. "They'll come," Jose replied without taking his eyes off Leon. "If there's one thing I've learned about Miguel Herrera, it's that he never leaves loose ends." At midnight, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. 3 vehicles approached slowly along the dirt road. Jose's heartbeat quickened. Leon went on full alert, ears pricked, body tense. "Stand by," Pedro ordered over the radio. "No one moves until my signal." The vehicle stopped in front of the warehouse. 6 armed men got out, moving cautiously. Among them, Jose recognized one of Herrera's lieutenants. The trap was set. The storm was about to break, and at the center of it all, Leon waited, as brave as ever, ready to face those who had tortured him. The plan collapsed spectacularly. Jose watched in horror as the warehouse doors gave way under the criminals. Violent push. There were at least 8 of them, all heavily armed and moving with the coordination of military training. The officer barely had time to dive behind wooden crates, dragging Leon with him. "They're trapped like rats," one attacker shouted, firing indiscriminately into the shadows at the back. Bullets whistled overhead, splintering wood and kicking up clouds of dust. Jose gripped his service weapon, knowing his ammunition was limited against the arsenal the criminals carried. Over the radio came Pedro Hernandez's broken voice. "Hold on, we're on our way." But the federal agent and his men were more than 10 minutes out, far too long when every second felt like the last. Leon growled beside him, hackles raised, eyes locked on the enemy. Despite his recent wounds, the dog showed the same determination Jose remembered from their best days as partners. "Get the dog first," a deep voice ordered, one Jose recognized as another of Herrera's lieutenants. "The boss wants him alive." Jose felt his blood boil. After all Leon had suffered, he would not let them take him again. He fired twice, forcing the attackers to fall back momentarily. Then he saw something that froze him. One of the men was handling a device with wires and a timer, an improvised explosive, powerful enough to level the warehouse. 30 seconds to get out, the man shouted, activating the detonator. Without hesitation, Leon shot from his hiding place like an arrow. The dog, instincts and training kicking in, launched himself at the criminal's arm, jaws clamping hard around the man's wrist. The detonator clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the air as Jose used the distraction to take down two attackers. Leon, though hit in the hind leg, didn't release the bomber until the man was unconscious. Sirens wailed in the distance. Realizing the tide had turned, the criminals began a disorderly retreat. When Pedro and his team stormed the warehouse, they found Jose kneeling beside Leon, pressing a strip of cloth to the dog's wound. "This damn hero just saved us all," the officer murmured, voice breaking as he stroked his old partner's dusty fur. Dawn painted the dry pine sky in shades of orange as the first prisoners were escorted to the station. Jose watched from the window, his heart torn between satisfaction and frustration. They had captured 6 members of the criminal network, but the real masterminds were still in the shadows. Pedro Hernandez, deep circles under his eyes after the night's operations, approached with a coffee in hand. "This is just the beginning, Jose. The big fish are slipperier." The officer nodded, absent-mindedly petting Leon, who stayed alert at his side as if he fully understood the gravity of the situation. That same afternoon, Clara Lopez took Luis Martin to the local store to buy him new clothes. The boy walked with his head down, still processing recent events, when he suddenly froze. His face went pale, eyes locked on a man paying at the counter. "It's him," he whispered, voice shaking, clutching Clara's arm. "The one who threatened me, the one who said he'd find me if I talked." The agent reacted instantly, discreetly guiding the teenager out of the store while dialing Jose. Minutes later, the patrol arrived, but the suspect was already gone. The news spread like wildfire. Soon, every resident of Dry Pine was looking over their shoulder, locking doors twice, and avoiding the streets after sunset. Paranoia settled into every corner of the town. At the station, Captain Ramirez called an urgent meeting. "Garcia, I understand your commitment, but this is getting out of control. The FBI will take over the case from here. Your priority now is to keep the town calm." Jose clenched his fists under the table. "With all due respect, sir, I can't abandon this investigation. These criminals used Leon, threatened a child, and have our community living in fear. I'm not stepping aside." The captain sighed, recognizing the unshakable determination in his subordinate's eyes. "You have 48 hours, not a minute more. After that, you follow orders or hand in your badge." That night, while reviewing case files at home, Jose received an unexpected visit from Tomas Garcia. The old man carried an ancient map of the region and a gaze heavy with secrets. "I know these men better than you think," murmured the town's guardian. "They have hideouts that don't appear in any official record." Jose spread the map out on the table, feeling for the first time that they had a real advantage. Leon patted over, sniffing the yellowed paper as if he too were searching for answers in those faded lines. The hunt was only beginning, and this time Jose was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. In the small meeting room at the station, Jose Garcia and Pedro Hernandez studied the files from the flash drive recovered from Leon's collar. The images on the screen made Jose clench his fists until his knuckles turned white. It wasn't just an isolated case. The coordinates and codes revealed a systematic operation stretching across the entire border region. "There are at least 20 more dogs being used as mules," Pedro murmured, sliding his finger across the digital map. "They mark them with these codes and surgically implant the packages." Clara Lopez walked in with coffee for everyone, but when she saw the photographs of mutilated animals, the cup trembled in her hands. She had developed a special bond with Leon during his recovery, and the thought of dozens more like him suffering in silence devastated her. "We have to find them," she declared, with a determination that surprised even her colleagues. "We can't leave them out there." Jose looked at her with admiration. Clara's empathy was exactly what Dry Pine needed, what he himself had lost after years of service in a town where the desert dust seemed to bury hope along with everything else. "The problem is, we don't know where they all are," Pedro interjected, pointing to scattered points on the map, "and Herrera constantly changes the routes." Luis Martin, who had been listening from a corner while petting Leon, approached the table timidly. The teenager, who had found refuge at the station after the attacks, cleared his throat before speaking. I know how they mark them," he said in a shaky voice. "My father told me before they took him." Everyone fell silent as the boy explained the system. Microscopic tattoos on the gums, scars in specific shapes, even ways of altering the fur to hide messages. Details only someone inside the organization could know. "They use temporary warehouses," Luis continued, pointing to 3 unmarked spots on the map. "Here, here, and here. They rotate them every week." Clara knelt in front of the boy and took his hands. "You're giving us a chance to save them," she said gently. "You're very brave." That same afternoon, Clara began organizing an animal rescue team with volunteer veterinarians from nearby towns. Leon watched from his corner, as if he understood that his suffering would help free others like him. Jose looked out the window, toward the relentless desert. The network was bigger and crueler than they had imagined, but now they had something they'd lacked before, the truth from the inside. And that truth, painful as it was, gave them the strength to keep going. Evening fell over Dry Pine, bathing the small station in orange light. Jose Garcia turned the pages of the files with tired fingers while Leon dozed at his feet. The only sound was the lazy whir of the ceiling fan, until Tomas Garcia entered carrying a box of dusty files. The old man set the box on the desk and sat across from Jose with a heaviness that went beyond physical fatigue. His eyes, usually sharp, seemed lost in painful memories. "There's something I never told you," Tomas murmured, pulling a worn photograph from his pocket. "My son Alejandro didn't leave Dry Pine for work like everyone thinks." Jose set the papers aside and looked at the image. A smiling young man beside a German shepherd, so much like Leon it was unsettling. A chill ran down the officer's spine. "Alejandro was a veterinarian," the town's guardian continued, his voice breaking. 7 years ago, he started noticing strange patterns. Missing dogs, animals with unexplained scars. Then he discovered they were also using children from vulnerable families. Leon lifted his head as if he understood every word. His intelligent eyes fixed on the old man's face as Tomas recounted how his son had gathered evidence, photographs, and testimonies. The night he was going to file a formal complaint, he disappeared. Tomas's voice cracked. "His car was found abandoned on the highway. They never found his body." Jose clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. Suddenly, the pieces fit together. The fierce protection Tomas had shown them, his knowledge of criminal movements, his unyielding resolve. "That's why you helped me that night," Jose whispered, finally understanding. The old man nodded, running a hand over Leon's fur. "When I saw this brave companion hanging from that tree, I saw the same cruelty that took my son. I couldn't let history repeat itself." A heavy silence filled the room. Jose stood and placed a hand on Tomas's shoulder. No words were needed. The shared pain had forged a bond stronger than blood. "We're going to finish what your son started," the officer promised, his voice renewed with determination. "Not just for Leon, but for Alejandro, and for everyone who can't defend themselves." Leon stepped forward and rested his head on Tomas's knee, offering comfort. The guardian stroked the dog's ears tenderly, and for the first time in years, Jose saw tears in the old man's eyes. The fight now had a deeper meaning. It was no longer just a police investigation, but a crusade for justice and the memory of the fallen. Pedro Hernandez arrived at the station with a grim expression, carrying a folder he dropped onto Jose Garcia's desk. The photographs inside revealed a truth no one had wanted to see. Miguel Herrera, the respected local businessman who was supposedly abroad for years, had been seen on the outskirts of Dry Pine just 3 days earlier. "He never left," Jose murmured, feeling the pieces click into place. He's been here the whole time, watching us." The FBI agent nodded, pointing to documents seized during recent arrests. The evidence was damning. Herrera had built a sophisticated system using dogs like Leon to transport not only drugs in their stomachs, but also encrypted information in devices hidden in their collars. "It's brilliant and twisted," Pedro explained. "The animals go unnoticed, and if one is caught, they just discard it." From the doorway, Clara Lopez clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. She had spent countless nights reviewing similar cases, and now everything made sense. "That's why Leon reacted to the evidence bag," she said. "He recognized the smell of what they made him carry." Jose walked to the window, staring out at Dry Pine's dusty horizon. Rage burned inside him at the thought of his canine partner being used as a disposable tool. How many more like him had suffered the same fate? "Herrera has contacts everywhere," the federal agent continued, spreading a map on the table. "Authorities, merchants, even at the veterinary clinic where they implanted the packages." Tomas Garcia, who had been silent in a corner, hobbled over and pointed to a spot on the map with a gnarled finger. "My son discovered something similar before he disappeared," he revealed, voice breaking. "He spoke of a businessman who used children and animals as couriers. No one believed him." Leon, lying by the door, lifted his head and let out a low growl as Luis Martin entered the room. The teenager brought news. He had recognized one of Herrera's men buying supplies at the local store. "They're preparing something big," the boy warned. "I heard them mention the final delivery." Jose stroked the coarse fur of his old friend as a cold determination settled in his chest. Miguel Herrera had been operating under their noses for years, shielded by his facade as a respectable businessman and his supposed absence. "The missing piece of the puzzle," Clara murmured, scanning the documents. "He was here all along." The group exchanged looks heavy with resolve. The truth was out, and now there was only one thing left to do: act. Black clouds gathered over Dry Pine, a harbinger of the coming storm. Jose Garcia checked his service weapon for the third time, glancing down at Leon lying by his feet. The dog, despite his injuries, seemed more alert than ever, as if he fully understood the gravity of what they were about to face. The abandoned factory loomed like a rusted giant on the outskirts of town. Its peeling walls and shattered windows had been silent witnesses to decades of neglect, now serving as the final refuge for Miguel Herrera and his organization. "Everyone's clear on the plan, right?" Pedro Hernandez asked, adjusting his bulletproof vest. "We can't afford mistakes tonight." Clara Lopez nodded as she checked the comms gear. The young officer had insisted on joining the operation despite the risks. Her determination to protect Leon and end the suffering of other animals had made her an essential part of the team. "Luis stays in the vehicle," Jose ordered, fixing the teenager with a firm look. "If anything goes wrong, you know what to do." The boy nodded nervously. His hands trembled, but in his eyes there was a resolve that hadn't been there weeks ago. He was no longer the frightened child they'd found in that dusty warehouse. Tomas Garcia, his shotgun gripped in hands weathered by time, stepped up to Jose. "My son would be proud of what we're doing today," the old man murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We won't let these bastards keep hurting people." A flash of lightning lit the sky, followed by the rumble of thunder. Rain began to fall, first softly, then in a furious downpour, as if nature itself wanted to cleanse the town of its past sins. The group advanced in formation toward the derelict structure. Leon moved at the front beside Jose, his wet coat doing nothing to dampen his resolve. Clara and Pedro covered the flanks while Tomas guarded the rear. Fear was palpable in every held breath, in every cautious step through the mud. But there was something stronger than fear, the certainty that this night could end the suffering and silence for everyone. "For those who didn't live to see this day," Clara whispered, briefly touching Leon's back. Jose looked at each of his companions in turn. Every one of them carried their own scars, visible and invisible. He knew they weren't invincible, that any of them could fall tonight. But together, bound by loyalty and an unshakable hunger for justice, they felt ready to face any darkness. With a silent gesture, Jose gave the signal. The operation had begun. Gunfire ripped through the night inside the abandoned factory. Jose Garcia crouched behind a rusted column, his heart pounding against his ribs. A few meters away, Leon panted heavily, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in his battered body. The exchange of fire stopped for a moment, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by muffled shouts and the creak of shifting debris. Clara Lopez, her face streaked with grime, signaled from her position. They had spotted Miguel Herrera trying to escape out the back. "Careful!" Tomas shouted from the far side. "They've got explosives!" The warning had barely left his lips when one of Herrera's men pulled a detonator from his jacket. Time seemed to slow. Jose recognized the immediate danger. They were surrounded by flammable materials, remnants of the factory's old production. Leon, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, lunged with desperate force. His legs, still weakened from past abuse, found strength in the adrenaline of the fight. The dog leapt straight at the man, sinking his teeth into the wrist holding the detonator. The man howled in pain as the device clattered to the floor. Without letting go, Leon dragged him out of anyone's reach. Blood from the dog's side stained the dusty concrete where a bullet had grazed him, but he refused to release his grip. "Leon!" Jose, this anguished cry merged with the chaos. Taking advantage of the confusion, Miguel Herrera tried to slip away into the smoke filling the space. Fueled by blind fury, Jose tackled him. The two men rolled across the floor in a violent struggle. The officer's fist struck the criminal's face again and again, releasing years of pent-up pain. "This is for Leon, for Tomas's son, for Luis, and for everyone you destroyed," he growled, snapping the cuffs onto Herrera's wrists. The crime boss, finally subdued, glared at the officer with hatred. His empire was collapsing under the wail of sirens closing in on the factory. Clara ran to Leon, who lay exhausted beside the unconscious criminal and the detonator. The dog's breathing was labored, but his gaze stayed locked on Jose, as if making sure his partner was safe. Pedro Hernandez entered with the tactical team, securing the perimeter as blue and red lights flashed through the broken windows. The operation was over. The cycle of violence that had begun years ago was finally closing under shouts of victory and the distant wail of ambulances. News of the rescue spread like wildfire across the country. In less than 48 hours, the tiny town of Dry Pine, usually forgotten on maps, was swarmed by news vans and curious onlookers in dust-covered cars. Cameras pointed toward the station, where Jose Garcia, deep circles under his eyes but a calm smile on his face, declined interviews while shielding Leon from intrusive attention. "He's a national hero," the news anchors declared, showing grainy footage of the raid. But for Jose, the real miracle was happening behind closed doors, far from the media circus. In the break room, now an improvised refuge, Leon dozed on a clean blanket, his scars still visible but a renewed light in his brown eyes. Clara Lopez sat beside him every afternoon, stroking his rough fur and whispering words of encouragement. "You'll never be alone again," she promised, wiping away tears she didn't bother to hide. Her dedication had been vital. The endless hours watching over the dog's recovery had forged an unbreakable bond. In a corner, Luis watched in quiet awe. The teenager, who had spent years sleeping with one eye open, was finally tasting real rest. Protected by this makeshift family, he began to smile shyly when Tomas told stories from his youth or when Pedro Hernandez brought him books on dog training. "Do you think I could have a dog someday?" Luis asked one afternoon as he helped Clara change Leon's bandages. "Maybe this big softy will need a playmate when he's better," she replied with a wink. The station had become the heart of a renewed community. Neighbors arrived with home-cooked meals, clean blankets, even toys for Leon. Some brought letters of thanks. Others simply wanted to see for themselves that the redemption story was real. One afternoon, as the reporters finally began to leave, Jose found Luis fast asleep beside Leon. The protective dog had rested his head on the boy's legs. Claire captured the moment on her phone, an image worth more than any official medal. "We've built something special here," Tomas murmured from the doorway. Jose nodded, feeling the weight in his chest grow lighter with each passing day. Healing had begun for all of them, weaving invisible but unbreakable bonds between souls brought together by fate at the exact moment they needed each other most. A week after the operation, the square in front of the Dry Pine courthouse was dressed for celebration. Mexican flags fluttered under the desert sun as the small community gathered to celebrate what many were already calling Leon's miracle. Jose Garcia watched from a corner, still uncomfortable with the attention but deeply moved. The mayor had organized a simple yet heartfelt ceremony: white chairs in a semicircle, a small stage, and a microphone that squealed occasionally. The townspeople, once fearful and silent, now chatted animatedly as they waited for the event to begin. Clara Lopez approached, leading Leon on a new leash. The dog walked with some difficulty, but his bearing was still majestic. Around his neck gleamed a special collar, silver engraved with his name and the word hero, a gift from the station's officers. "You should be up there with him," Clara whispered to Jose, nodding toward the stage. He shook his head, but Luis Martin, now Leon's inseparable shadow, gave him a gentle push. "Come on, he needs you there," the teenager urged with a shy smile. When Leon limped up the 3 steps to the stage, spontaneous applause erupted from the crowd. At first confused, the dog seemed to understand it was for him. He lifted his head, locking eyes with Jose, who finally stepped forward to join him. In the front row, Tomas Garcia discreetly wiped away a tear. The old man had brought a photograph of his missing son, as if to make him part of this moment of justice. Pedro Hernandez, the federal agent, gave a brief speech on courage and community cooperation, noting that thanks to the evidence recovered, 3 more clandestine labs had been dismantled in neighboring states. When Jose finally took the microphone, the words caught in his throat. He looked at Leon, stroked his scarred back, and simply said, "He never abandoned me." I abandoned him, but he gave me a second chance. The community responded with a respectful silence that soon turned into applause. Women, men, and children came forward to pet the dog and shake the officer's hand. Amid embraces and words of gratitude, Jose felt something inside him begin to heal. As the sun began to set behind the low buildings of Dry Pine, Leon received his official medal. The weight of guilt on Jose's shoulders had not completely disappeared, but for the first time in 2 years, he breathed a little easier. His partner's sacrifice, his unwavering loyalty, had not been in vain. The months passed like clouds over the Dry Pine desert. Leon's physical wounds healed slowly, leaving marks that told a story of survival. The nights of nightmares gave way to calmer sleep, especially when he lay by the fire in the new home he shared with Jose Garcia. His coat, once dull and lifeless, now shone in the sunset as he rested in the station's backyard. Luis Martin, who had found a temporary home with Tomas, visited the station every afternoon after school. The boy laughed genuinely for the first time in years as he threw a worn ball that Leon chased with renewed enthusiasm. His eyes, once full of fear, now reflected the hope of someone who had found a safe place in the world. "I never thought I'd see him like this," remarked Clara Lopez from the doorway, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "It's like he's a different dog." Jose nodded silently. The officer had changed too. The worry lines were still there, but the guilt that had consumed him had transformed into determination. Every morning, upon waking, he looked at the plaque that now hung beside a photograph of Leon receiving his recognition. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Tomas Garcia arrived carrying a carved wooden box under his arm. The old man set it on the station table with solemnity. "This belonged to my son," he explained, his voice breaking. "He documented everything he saw. Maybe it will help prevent this from happening again." Inside were photographs, notes, and detailed maps of the region. The 3 adults exchanged glances, understanding the value of that legacy. That same night, under the dim light of a lamp, they sealed a silent pact. They would be the guardians of Dry Pine, protectors of those who could not defend themselves. Clara established a rescue shelter for animals on the outskirts of town. Jose implemented a community watch program. Tomas, with his years of wisdom, became the storyteller who would keep the memory alive. The town had changed. Doors were no longer locked so tightly at nightfall. Children played in the central square, while Leon, with his new red collar, kept watch from the shade of a tree. The cruelty and silence that had once reigned in Dry Pine had been replaced by something many thought lost forever: hope. The story of Jose Garcia and Leon was never told as a grand epic on the national news. As the weeks passed, the journalists left Dry Pine, and life returned to its slow rhythm under the desert sun. But in the dusty streets of the town, the tale of loyalty lived on in small, everyday gestures. One Sunday afternoon, Jose stood in the station doorway, watching Luis Martin, in brand new shoes, running around the central square with Leon. The boy who months earlier had trembled, hiding among boxes, now laughed without restraint, while the dog, healed from his wounds, barked playfully as he chased him. Clara Lopez approached with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her partner. "Who would have thought we'd end up as such a strange family?" she said with a smile. A few meters away, Tomás Garcia was carving a wooden whistle for the boy, his weathered hands working with the patience of someone who has learned that rebuilding is more valuable than revenge. The true victory had not been capturing Miguel Herrera and dismantling his network. The real triumph was in the eyes of the townspeople, who no longer looked down when passing each other in the streets, in the doors that were once again left open at night, in the trust that had been restored. The officer stroked Leon's scars, remembering how that battered body had once hung from a tree at dawn. Now the animal slept peacefully each night, without the tremors that had woken him in the early weeks. His nightmares had faded, just like José's. At the local school, children drew pictures of a dog wearing a superhero cape, and at the entrance to the town, a small plaque quietly commemorated all the animals who had been victims of trafficking. There were no grand monuments or pompous ceremonies. The community of Dry Pine preferred to honor what had happened through action: a shelter for abandoned dogs, neighborhood patrols, watchful eyes that would no longer tolerate complicit silence. Pedro Hernandez visited occasionally, bringing news of other successful operations inspired by what they had achieved together. The criminal network had been completely dismantled. Jose finally understood that power did not lie in weapons or official badges. Sometimes a simple bark in the dark, the unwavering loyalty of a friend, or the courage of a teenager to break the silence, could spark a revolution of kindness more powerful than any threat. As the sun set over Dry Pine, Leon lifted his head and looked at Jose, as if both knew that some battles are won simply by coming home.